Title, 1984, The Fall of the Party. The clock struck 13, but something was different. Winston Smith felt the change before he could articulate it. The stale air of the Ministry of Truth, which had for years tasted of synthetic despair, seemed ever so slightly charged with something foreign. Hope, maybe. He had returned from the ministry cafeteria to find a scrap of paper slid beneath the false floorboard in the corner of his flat, its familiar hidden space. A scrap, bearing only 3 words, "It begins tonight." There was no signature. But he knew. O'Brien. He had not seen the man in weeks. After their last encounter, after the torture, the betrayals, the endless reprogramming, Winston had assumed it was over. That the Brotherhood, if it had ever existed, was a fiction. That resistance was dust. But then came the note, its presence a quiet earthquake. That night, Winston made the walk to Victory Square with care. The telescreens watched, as always, but something in their gaze had shifted. Or maybe it was just his imagination flaring to life again after years of dormancy. He spotted Julia by the statue of Big Brother, right where she had promised never to meet him again. She gave a subtle nod. The smallest rebellion. They walked in silence, not touching. Through the back alleys near the wreckage of the old cathedral, they entered a doorway hidden behind layers of propaganda posters. The room was dark, the air filled with dust and the scent of long-buried paper. And there, in the flickering light of a candle, an actual candle, stood O'Brien. "Welcome," he said, and this time, there was no deception. The room was lined with books. Real books. Typewritten pamphlets. Maps. Diagrams. Symbols unfamiliar and stirring. Winston felt as though he had walked not just into a room, but into another world, one he had stopped believing could ever exist. O'Brien watched them quietly. He had changed. His face was leaner, as though he had shed more than flesh, an illusion of authority, maybe. "You've both suffered," he said. "You've both survived. That makes you dangerous." Winston wanted to scream, to accuse, to rage about room 101 and the rats and the mind-breaking pain. But the words would not come. The past had to remain where it was if there was to be a future. O'Brien placed a hand on Winston's shoulder. "I did what I had to. So you'd be ready." The Brotherhood was real. It had existed in shadows for decades, fragmented and hunted, infiltrated time and again. But O'Brien had not broken. He had climbed the ranks of the inner party, not for power, but for knowledge. For position. For proximity. He had become one of them to destroy them. And now, he said, the time had come. The party was weak. The economy was crumbling. Eurasia was turning inward. The proles were restless. Most importantly, the neural override systems developed by the thought police had backfired, creating glitches in the surveillance grid. There were now pockets of darkness, places where Big Brother's eyes could not see. "That's where we begin," O'Brien said. For the next 3 months, Winston and Julia lived double lives. By day, they performed their duties. Julia in the fiction department, churning out lies. Winston at his rewriting desk, painting the past with falsehoods. By night, they met with others like them, technicians who falsified data, but saved the truth in secret drives, cooks who poisoned inner party rations with memory-altering serums, children raised in the junior spies who now questioned the very idea of obedience. The rebellion grew not as an army, but as a virus. Invisible. Viral. It moved through words, glances, misfiled reports, and sabotaged telescreens. Through deliberate misprints in party slogans, "War is peace" became "War is a choice." The slogans weren't corrected. Some believed the changes intentional. Uncertainty began to spread. Then came the broadcast. On the morning of Hate Week, the largest public demonstration in Airstrip 1, a glitch seized the central telescreen. The face of Big Brother flickered, stuttered, then vanished. In its place appeared O'Brien, not in party uniform, but in black plain, stark, real. To those who still see, he said, know this, Big Brother is not watching you. He never was. He is a ghost. A mask. The true rulers sit behind it, faceless, nameless, and afraid. But their time is over. Chaos erupted. Party officials screamed for the screen to be cut. Technicians refused. Soldiers hesitated. Then one brave soul in the crowd cheered. It spread like fire. Within hours, ministry buildings were burning. The thought police headquarters crumbled under coordinated explosions. Power grids were knocked out. The city fell into darkness, not of oppression, but of freedom. The first free night in decades. Winston, Julia, and O'Brien stood on the rooftop of the old Ministry of Truth, now overtaken by rebels. From there, they watched as a crowd tore down the statue of Big Brother. The face that had haunted them all crashed to the pavement, shattering into dust. It's not over, O'Brien warned. The world will resist change. People will long for the safety of control. We must give them something better. They began the work of rebuilding. Not a government, but a dialogue. A collective of cells across former Oceania who would share power, distribute knowledge, teach critical thought. History, uncensored, returned to libraries. Truth was no longer edited, it was pursued. In the weeks that followed, Winston wrote again. But this time, not for the ministry. He wrote the true history of the world. Of the party. Of resistance. Of betrayal and redemption. He titled it simply, 1984. And when he read it aloud in the central plaza of Airstrip 1, now renamed Liberty Square, Julia held his hand. No telescreen loomed above them. No slogan barked from the walls. Only people, listening. Remembering. Learning. The brotherhood disbanded, not in defeat, but in fulfillment of purpose. It was no longer needed. The people had taken up the mantle. O'Brien vanished from public life. Some said he left for the colonies to help spark uprisings there. Others believed he simply walked into the crowd and lived the rest of his life as a man among men, not a leader, not a myth. Winston and Julia remained. They aged. They argued. They laughed. They loved, without fear. And every year, on the anniversary of the fall, the bells of the old cathedral rang 13 times, not as a warning, but as a celebration. A reminder that even the most total darkness cannot survive a single spark of truth. Big Brother had died. But the people had been born again. Winston continued writing well into the nights, long after the fires of the revolution had cooled and society had begun to reassemble itself from the rubble. He no longer feared the creaking of doors or the sudden burst of a telescreen. In this new world, silence did not mean surveillance, it meant peace. But the weight of history, of memory, pressed heavy on his pen. He understood now that freedom wasn't simply the absence of chains, but the presence of understanding. The work of dismantling the old regime was slow, sometimes painful. There were those who had profited from the party's rule, who had internalized its teachings, who longed for the comfort of being told what to do and think. Some among the populace clung to the past like addicts to a needle. In the absence of a single authority, old rivalries flared up, regional factions, ideological purists, opportunists looking to carve new hierarchies out of the vacuum. O'Brien had prepared for this. Before his disappearance, he had trained a new generation of thinkers, people who could facilitate dialogue, not dictate ideology. They called themselves the custodians, but they held no weapons, wore no uniforms, and took no oaths. Their job was not to lead, but to listen. They walked from town to town, sharing the truth, gathering stories, reminding people of what they had fought to achieve, not a new tyranny, but a world where power could not hide behind lies. Julia found her role in rebuilding education. She helped open the first free school of Airstrip 1, nestled in a converted ministry warehouse. The first lesson taught to every child was how to question. Question authority, question memory, question themselves. It was dangerous, messy, sometimes chaotic, but it was alive. The children painted murals over old propaganda, trees growing through cracked pavement, families unbroken, birds in flight. Symbols of hope, indirect, spontaneous. For a time, the world held its breath, watching. In Eurasia, whispers of rebellion spread. Not in the old, violent form of coups or terror cells, but in poetry, in censored music, in university debates. In East Asia, a group of former party defectors established a memory archive, filled with testimonies from the disappeared, the imprisoned, the forgotten. The idea caught fire. It was as if humanity, long buried beneath the cement of totalitarianism, had begun to push up through the cracks. Winston received letters from survivors in other territories. Messages written in shaky English, thanking him for 1984, which had become more than a chronicle, it had become a manual. A warning. A promise. He reread it often, surprised at how little he had changed the original manuscript. His torture, his betrayals, his near death, it was all there. The failure. The despair. And yet, by preserving it, he had captured something no fiction could reproduce. The depth of what it meant to forget yourself, and the miracle of rediscovering your name. Julia called it the second birth of humanity. She was no romantic, not in the Hallmark sense, but when she said those words, Winston believed them. After all, hadn't they both been reborn? They were not young anymore. The rebellion had aged them, grayed their hair, hardened their joints. And yet, they found joy in small rituals, morning tea on the balcony of their modest apartment in the heart of Liberty Square, where the statue of Big Brother had once loomed. Now, there stood an open circle, empty, symbolic. A space deliberately left unfilled. No idols. No gods. Just the sky. One day, a girl of about 7 approached Winston as he was walking home. She was holding a copy of 1984, the pages well thumbed and marked with questions. "Did you really write this?" she asked. He nodded. She frowned. "Why didn't you stop them earlier?" Winston smiled, sad but proud. "I wasn't ready. None of us were." The girl's eyes narrowed. "Are we ready now?" He knelt down, touched the book in her hands. "You are." She ran off, and he watched her go, disappearing into the crowd. There were still ghosts, of course. People who whispered that the party wasn't truly gone. That the Brotherhood had simply replaced one master with another. That O'Brien was a dictator in exile, waiting to return. Conspiracy theories bloomed like weeds. But Winston had learned that truth was not the absence of lies, but the ability to distinguish them. On the 10th anniversary of the fall, the people gathered in Liberty Square. There were no parades, no military displays. Just voices, each given time, each given respect. Some told stories of the camps. Others recited poems. One old woman sang a lullaby she'd never been allowed to sing as a mother, not in public, not even in whispers. Now, she sang it with tears rolling down her cheeks, and strangers held hands. Winston was the last to speak. He stepped to the simple wooden platform, looked out over the sea of faces, young, old, skeptical, hopeful. "We once lived in a world where truth was a crime," he said. "Where history was erased daily, where love was treason. We survived that world. We tore it down. But let this be said clearly, it will return if we forget. The real revolution is memory." He paused. The square was silent. "So remember. All of it. The pain. The lies. The mistakes. And remember that we chose to be more. He stepped down, and Julia joined him. Together they walked, not toward a destination, but into the flow of the people. No guards. No barriers. No posters. No fear. In the months that followed, the Free Territories formalized their union, not a nation-state, but a cooperative of autonomous regions. Each had its own local councils, its own customs. But all agreed on 3 universal laws, drafted not in secrecy, but in an open convention. No person may be made to forget what is true. No authority may exist without accountability. No life is beneath dignity. These principles were etched into walls and stones, not as decrees, but as reminders. Any attempt to rewrite them, or ignore them, was met not with force, but with fierce public discourse. Culture became the guardian of freedom. Winston and Julia lived to see the first generation of freeborn children graduate. Their minds were untouched by the thought police, their eyes unclouded by doublethink. They questioned everything, even 1984. Especially 1984. Some dismissed it as a relic. Others taught it as a myth. A few criticized Winston directly for failing to act sooner, for his time of submission. He welcomed all of it. To be questioned, to be challenged, to be doubted, that was the freedom he had dreamed of during his darkest hours in room 101. He had once believed that love could not survive the party, but now he saw it everywhere. In the eyes of strangers. In the laughter of children. In the silence that no longer threatened. When Winston finally passed, quietly, in his sleep beside Julia, he was buried not in a state cemetery, but in a public garden. His grave was unmarked, as he had requested. No statues, no name. But beside it stood a tree. A simple plaque at its base read, "He remembered. So we could forget fear." Julia lived on, tending the garden. When asked why she stayed, she would smile and quote Winston's favorite line from his writings, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. Because someone will always try to make it 5, she would say, and someone else has to be there to laugh in their face." And the world kept turning. Not perfect. Not painless. But real. The party was gone. The people remained. And they were finally, gloriously, awake. The death of Winston Smith sent quiet ripples through the Free Territories. There was no state funeral, no wreaths from ministries that no longer existed. And yet, for days, people arrived at the garden where he had been laid to rest, many of them carrying nothing but their thoughts. They sat in the grass, they read from his book, they left scraps of writing in the soil beside the roots of the tree that grew from the place he had chosen. The old fear of being seen, of being watched, was gone. They mourned openly. But the world did not stop. It had been 13 years since the fall. A generation born without chains had now come of age. They were eager, restless, curious, and often ungrateful. To many of them, the slogans of the old regime sounded ridiculous, like bad jokes from a theater play. Ignorance is strength. Freedom is slavery. The words meant nothing to them but symbols of a time they couldn't imagine. Julia sometimes felt the strangeness of that shift. She remembered the taste of stale Victory gin, the clang of boots on concrete floors, the cold grip of surveillance. She remembered holding back her tears in a dormitory of silent girls, knowing that crying could be interpreted as guilt. The young ones cried freely now, laughed freely, kissed in broad daylight without consequence. Sometimes, she found herself annoyed by their softness. But then she would remember how long they had fought for this softness to be possible. She continued her work at the free school, now renamed the People's Library and Learning Exchange. No formal curriculum existed. Children and adults learned together, side by side, following whatever questions moved them. 1 month it was astronomy. Another, the fall of ancient empires. Occasionally, they studied the party not as victims, but as analysts, historians, future protectors of truth. A bright-eyed student named Kasia once asked Julia, "Why didn't you just run away?" Julia laughed, not unkindly. There was nowhere to run. The world was a cage. It looked like the sky, but it was all bars. "But now there are no bars," the girl said confidently. Julia only smiled. The custodians, now called simply the Council of Listeners, met once every year in a different free territory. They had no president, no capital, no standing military. What they had was consensus, slow, imperfect, and fragile. But they considered every decision as a group, even when they disagreed. Especially when they disagreed. When a famine struck the former southern provinces of what had once been East Asia, some argued that aid would only rebuild dependency. Others insisted it was a moral imperative. Julia traveled there herself, along with a delegation of artists and engineers. They brought not just supplies, but ideas, water purification systems, self-sustaining gardens, portable printing presses. They taught people how to become sovereign. In return, they learned new music, new stories, new recipes. The cultures long buried beneath the party's gray monoculture began to emerge again like flowers in spring. But not all was peace. A new movement began to rise in the Western territories, calling itself the Order of Unity. Its members wore black coats, spoke in slogans, and demanded the return of discipline. They claimed to be apolitical, but their actions mirrored old patterns. They painted over murals, disrupted public forums, accused free educators of spreading chaos. Julia attended one of their rallies undercover. She heard a young man declare, "Freedom has made us weak. We need structure. We need to belong to something larger than ourselves." It chilled her. Afterward, she met with the local council and proposed a bold idea, a memory chamber. Not a museum, but a living exhibit where survivors of the party could speak directly to citizens, especially the young. Where old surveillance devices were kept in working order so that people could see what control had looked like. Where the smell of stale corridors, the scripts of interrogations, and even the sound of Room 101's mechanical door could be experienced, not glorified, but understood. They called it the Archive of Silence. Visitors often left in tears. Others left quiet and thoughtful. A few returned angry, confused, ashamed that their parents or grandparents had ever accepted such a world. Julia once stood at the entrance of the archive as a boy of 14 exited. He looked up at her and said, "We can't ever let this happen again." She nodded. "Then you'll have to fight for the rest of your life. Not with weapons. With memory." Elsewhere, in what had once been Canada, a university declared the first open international memory forum. Delegates arrived from as far as the Indian Ocean territories and the old African continent. There was no formal language, so sessions were translated live. They shared stories, and for the first time in human history, a global audience listened without filters. A historian from former North America told of cities turned into obedience zones. A woman from what was once Siberia recited a poem written by her grandmother on a scrap of birch bark, hidden for 40 years in the lining of her shoe. A man from the Sahel region described planting trees where execution pits had once been. Julia did not speak at the conference. She sat among the crowd, anonymous, and wept. Somewhere beyond the edges of the free territories, the old powers still lurked. Isolated city-states. Remnants of inter-party structures hiding behind rebranded councils and security systems. There were rumors of genetic purity programs resurfacing. Quiet chatter of new surveillance platforms built with satellite arrays and artificial cognition. But the world had changed. Too many now knew the truth. Too many had tasted freedom. O'Brien was never found. Some believed he had died in the early skirmishes after the fall. Others swore they had seen him in the southern ports, working as a translator, or planting wheat in reclaimed fields. A few insisted he was watching from the shadows, ensuring the new world did not fall into the traps of the old. Winston had once written that hope lay with the proles. He had not been wrong. But it was also with the thinkers, the teachers, the poets. With people like Julia. With children like Kasia. With every citizen who stood up and said, "I remember." Years later, when Julia was old, a new threat loomed. An artificial intelligence network, resurrected from old party technology, had been found in a forgotten data vault. Its interface, coded in Newspeak, had begun auto-generating propaganda based on dormant algorithms. Though isolated, it spoke with the voice of Big Brother. The council debated what to do. Some wanted it deleted. Others feared deleting it would be the very act of censorship they had fought against. Julia, now more listener than leader, offered her advice. "Let it speak," she said. "Let people hear the voice that once held us in chains. Then let them answer it." The AI was broadcast on a public forum. Its messages were sterile, menacing, repetitive. But then the people began to respond in essays, in debates, in laughter. Children recorded musical remixes of its slogans. Artists projected it onto abandoned walls with mocking subtitles. And in the end, the AI simply stopped. Overwhelmed by the data of dissent. It had no logic to handle a world unafraid of its words. The final transmission from the machine read, "Error, truth not found." And that became the title of a new movement, not resistance, not revolution, resilience. Julia died 2 winters later, peacefully, in her home surrounded by books and letters from those she had taught. Her grave was placed beside Winston's, beneath the same tree. The plaque below read, "She remembered love. And it was enough." The free territories matured with time, but they never settled into complacency. Freedom, they had learned, was not a moment of victory but a practice, an unending discipline of honesty, accountability, and collective memory. Every 5 years, on the day they now called Remembrance Day, communities around the world held open assemblies. No speeches were written in advance. No one person presided. Any citizen could step forward and speak, provided they shared a memory, not a fantasy, not a dream, but a truth, personal, painful, or profound. Some recounted abuses under the party. Others spoke of their complicity, their silence, or how they had looked away when a neighbor was taken. Confession was not punishment. It was healing. One year, a man stood trembling before a crowd in the central plaza of what had once been London. "I worked for the Ministry of Plenty," he said. "I falsified numbers. I said production increased when it didn't. I made people believe they were being fed when they were starving. No one booed. No one condemned." He continued. "I didn't know how to stop. But when the broadcasts ended, and the screens went black, I felt relief. And then guilt. So now I grow food. I teach others how to do it. It's not enough. But I remember. Every day. I remember." Applause rose, not in celebration, but in solidarity. Children were taught not to shame their parents for what they had done or failed to do, but to understand what had been done to them. The culture of blame died quietly, replaced by a commitment to protect one another's humanity. Yet, dangers persisted not from old enemies, but from human nature itself. In one territory, a charismatic speaker gained popularity for promising total clarity and purity of logic. His movement spread fast, particularly among youth. He spoke fluently, compellingly, appealing to the deep desire for certainty that had lain dormant beneath years of uncertainty. Julia would have recognized the danger instantly. But she was gone. Instead, it was Kasia, now grown, a teacher in her own right, who confronted it. She attended one of his rallies and stood silently at the back. When asked by a follower if she agreed with the speaker's vision, she answered with a story. "My mother used to tell me," she said, "that control is seductive because it removes the burden of choice. But if you let someone else choose what's true, then you've given up the right to be human. The follower blinked. But don't you want clarity? I want truth. And truth isn't simple. It doesn't fit on a banner or in a speech. Sometimes it hurts. But it belongs to everyone. The speaker's movement faltered not through confrontation, but by exposure. People began asking questions. Dissent spread. Soon, he faded into irrelevance, just another echo of an old world that no longer held power. Technology, too, had to be reclaimed. In the early years after the fall, people were terrified of machines. They dismantled telescreens, burned microphones, smashed recording devices. But as memory replaced fear, technologists rose with a new purpose: to rebuild tools that empowered, not controlled. The first transparent network was launched 2 decades after the fall. No passwords. No hidden code. Every algorithm could be audited, every decision traced. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't hidden. Users became stakeholders. Data could not be owned, only shared. It was slow, but trust grew. A young developer named Ellen wrote the foundational code for a global truth archive. It wasn't a news service, it was a collection of parallel perspectives. Any event could be logged by thousands of people, with notes, dates, annotations. Over time, facts emerged not because someone declared them, but because they were witnessed by many. Winston would have wept to see it. Journalists, once hunted and silenced, became celebrated figures again, not as influencers, but as guardians. Their creed was simple: verify, contextualize, protect the vulnerable. They trained not just professionals, but citizens. Fact-checking became a public art, practiced by teenagers and grandparents alike. In this new world, disagreement was not a threat but a sign of life. Debates were held publicly, not to score points, but to seek clarity. And when someone changed their mind, they were praised, not shamed, for the courage to evolve. The free territories remained ungoverned in the traditional sense. There were no flags, no passports. Borders were defined by dialogue, not walls. Some communities chose to isolate, others to connect. Travel was free, and so was information. What tied people together was not nationalism, but shared memory and mutual trust. At the 25th anniversary of the fall, a global celebration was held not in one location, but everywhere at once. In gardens, in libraries, in open-air theaters. People sang old songs once banned. Children performed plays based on Winston and Julia's life. Elders told stories of dark rooms and stolen words, and how the light had returned. That night, a message was projected on buildings across every territory. It read, "War is not peace. Freedom is not slavery. Ignorance is not strength. We remember. We remain free." It was followed by a moment of silence. And then the people danced. For the first time in remembered history, a civilization had overthrown tyranny without replacing it with another. They had resisted the urge to centralize, to dominate, to simplify. They had chosen the mess of freedom over the order of control. The story of Winston and Julia became more than history. It became a reminder, a myth, perhaps, but one rooted in fact. A museum was eventually built near the site of the old Ministry of Love. But it was not about the party. It was about recovery. It told the story of what came after, how love survived, how memory endured, how people chose not to forget. Visitors left with a single page torn from 1984. Not the whole book. Just one quote. "If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever." But underneath, handwritten in bold ink, it said, "Only if we stop watching. Only if we forget. We won't." That was the promise of the free territories. That was the world Winston helped build, not with power, but with memory.